Hello again. Hi. So this for the next half an hour or so, I'm going to speak about the idea that boys don't read. Before I do, I should say all the things that I spoke about earlier in the presentation before about reader development, and most of the things I'm talking about in this presentation and tomorrow are featured in a longer document with internet links as well, so you can visit the websites particular to the projects that I've spoken about, and that's going to be available in English and Korean in 2 months once it's been translated. So that'll be available soon, and that will have all the information that one or two of you, well, 4 or 5 of you have been asking me for. Anyway, to boys. Boys don't read. That's the perception in England, in the UK. In the UK, surveys have been done, and the results in education show that boys are behind girls in literacy, also in how they feel about reading. So if you look at the results between boys and girls, boys are usually there's 10% less doing well, roughly 8 to 10% less doing well in literacy. So schools and libraries and the educational establishment have identified boys as a target for improving literacy. As a result of that, there are many schemes to encourage boys to read, and I'm going to be speaking. Hopefully, if I can get this to work. Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to be speaking about 10 particular schemes. In the document that you'll be able to access in a couple of months, there are several more, but I thought I'd focus on 10 and give them a slight amount more time. So these are the schemes that are being used in the UK to encourage boys to read. I apologise for the fact that most of the schemes that I'm going to be talking about, I think 7 of them, involve football or soccer. I mean, and I know the same's similar here, but football is a big deal in England. It seems to be, when I talk to children, 9 out of 10 boys in particular love football. And also I suppose I know more about the football ones because I write my books are all about football as well. So a lot of them are about football, but many of them are transferable, such as to rugby or something like that. Anyway. That's different. It is for me. Anyway, so I'm just going to run through these. I'm going to give each one a couple of minutes and describe them. So we'll start with going backwards. Reading Champions. Reading Champions is a really effective scheme, and I've been involved in models of this in the UK. And the idea is to choose some of the older boys in the school. This is usually a primary school, so under the age of 11. Choose some of the older boys to encourage the younger boys to read. And to do this through various means, such as getting older boys to talk about what they like to read in assembly to the younger boys. Doing workshops, activities, where the older boys run sessions with the younger boys. And one-to-one, there's something in the UK called buddying at the moment, where older children befriend the younger children and read with them or talk to them about positive choices they could make at school. The older boys, as you know, are usually role models to the younger boys in school, and that is seen as a way of creating a reading culture, and it's as much for the older boys as it is for the younger boys. So the younger boys look up to the big boys, and they see them being into reading, and they will feel more inclined to read. But the older boys as well take it as a responsibility. Often the boys that are chosen are ones who get into a bit of trouble, who are the ones in the playground that might be behaving badly, and they are taken and they're empowered and given responsibility to encourage the younger boys to read, and it works. And I particularly think of a boy called James. There's a town, not a very well-off town in England called Basildon, which is about 30 miles away from London. And I worked there doing this very thing. And there was a boy called James who was trouble. He caused trouble in the playground. He used to get thrown out of assembly. In the classroom, half the classes that I worked on with him, he would be removed because he used to disrupt things and cause trouble. But we encouraged him to be a reading champion, and we encouraged him through his love of football, and we had him speak in an assembly, and he spoke to these younger children about how he liked to read football magazines. There's one called Match, and there's one called Match of the Day. And he spoke about that, and I'll never forget how he walked through the hall in the assembly, and everyone was looking at him, the boys and the girls, and because this was the big hard lad, the cool boy in the school, and he walked up to the front, and everyone's faces went like that, and he had their attention like that, and then he spoke about how much he loved football magazines, and it was brilliant. It was really, you could see the effect it was having on both him as making him a responsible person in the school, but also the younger children. And I was really delighted. It's 4 or 5 years since I worked with him, and I did worry that he was going to go off the rails and have a very bad time at high school, but he emailed me recently for the first time in years and told me that he was doing his GCSEs, so his exams when he's 15, 16, and he was doing well, and he thanked me for involving him in that scheme, and it was so lovely to see that it hadn't just helped the younger children in the school, but that it helped him get into reading and do well with his studies. So that's Reading Champions. I'm pointing it the wrong way. Right. The next thing I'm going to speak about is the NYR's National Year of Reading. I spoke about that earlier, the National Year of Reading. As I said earlier, there was a theme for each month in the National Year of Reading. And the theme, when the theme was sport, which happened both times there was a National Year of Reading in the United Kingdom, a lot of libraries and schools did reading promotion around sport. And one thing they were encouraged to do is form partnerships. So schools and libraries formed partnerships with local football clubs or with other sports clubs. And that was a really good way of getting a boys interested in sport. For instance, if a local cricket club sent a couple of their players in to speak about how they love to read, that was one idea as a model. Or many of the football and rugby and cricket clubs in the United Kingdom have a classroom in the stadium, and that was an opportunity for schools to take children into that classroom in the stadium. One of the things that works quite well at schools in England is if you bring someone in from a sports club, someone who's wearing a tracksuit, it doesn't really matter who they are, but if they're wearing a sports tracksuit, the boys will listen to them because they look like they've got something to do with sport. And it's true, and I went in with a colleague of mine who does a similar job to me, and I was wearing a T-shirt and jeans, and he was wearing a tracksuit, and they didn't really listen to me. They just listened to him because he looked like he was a sporting person, and it worked. And that's one of the things to bear in mind if you want to use those sort of techniques. This was also very useful because as I said earlier, it set off lots of relationships and showed libraries. In the UK, a lot of librarians aren't keen to work with other partners. They feel, I suppose it's slightly controversial, I suppose they feel quite shy of working with organisations like sports clubs, but in this case, it showed that it could happen, and more librarians became confident in the way that the boys were becoming more confident by working with these organisations. And it led to a number of other schemes, many of which I'm going to be mentioning now. You do that, didn't you? Right. The next one I want to mention is the football reading game, which I've called the FRG. The football reading game is one of the activities I do. Many authors in the UK, when they go into schools, they don't just want to go in and talk about their book and try and sell books. They want to engage children with reading, and then they need a technique to encourage the children to read. So there's one author called Tommy Donbavand who does a game show style event where he gets children to come up and compete in a game show sort of activity. And that is a construct that children are familiar with, and it's quite a good way of sort of getting them into reading without them really knowing that it's a session about reading and literacy. So I do something called the football reading game, and it's a game of two halves. The first half is a quiz about different things you can read about football. So I have the newspaper headlines from that day. I black out a word, and the children have to guess what the word is. I have football magazines, and they have to guess the identity of the footballer on the cover. Or I show them book covers, and they have to answer questions about that. But really, as well as that, I'm getting them to talk about reading. I try and encourage the children to talk about, yes, this boy loves... Well, for instance, you'll have a boy at the beginning who will say, oh, is this about reading? I hate reading. But later on, you'll be talking about newspapers, and he says, oh, I read a match report about my favourite team last week. And then, oh, I like Match magazine, or I've read Wayne Rooney's autobiography. And I say to him, but you read newspapers, magazines, and books, and websites. And he says, yeah, but that's not real reading. And that is one of the big problems, is that the children who are quite good at reading about football, they don't see it as real reading, perhaps because someone has told them that it's not real reading, or perhaps because they think they're enjoying it so much. It can't be like work. So it's sort of breaking down the barriers and the definitions of what reading is. So what we do is we do this quiz, and every child that gets a question right, they get to take a penalty. I take a large goal with me into school. We have a penalty shootout, often with a head teacher in goal. And that encourages them to engage with it, even if they're not interested in me or in reading. They want to win the trophy. I take along a little trophy as a prize. And that is just one example of a model how you can use sport to engage children with reading. And there's a link in the document that you'll be accessing soon. There's a link to my website where it describes how to run the football reading game, if that appeals to you. Right, so that's the football reading game. Thank you. Right, PLRS is the major football-related boy-targeting reader development programme in the UK. It's called Premier League Reading Stars, and it's a partnership between the Premier League and the National Literacy Trust. The National Literacy Trust is one of the 4 charities that I mentioned earlier who does reader development work in the UK. And what they do is every Premier League football club in the country each year puts forward a player, and the player is interviewed online about why they like reading, what they like to read. They name a favourite children's book, a favourite adult book, and there are videos about them saying why they enjoyed reading. And the children watch the videos, and then the footballers ask them questions, and the children have to answer the questions. And it's because they're looking at videos of footballers. Wayne Rooney did it a couple of years ago, and everyone wanted to know what his favourite books were, and they wanted to answer his questions, because if they got all the questions right in this quiz, they then got a signed certificate from Wayne Rooney. So it's using football, but there's a lot more to this scheme. There are sort of 15 classroom sessions. One is about newspapers, using newspapers to get children to read about sport in newspapers. One's magazines, one's books. One's about Twitter. It's about following footballers on Twitter, although we do censor and edit it quite heavily sometimes. But it's finding ways of encouraging children to read about their big passion, which is football. And it has an enormous effect. It's the children that are targeted for these sessions. It's not every child. It's groups of 10 children who have been targeted by the teacher who are not into reading. They don't like reading. They say they hate reading, but they love football. They're obsessed with football. They talk about football all day long. And if you can engineer or if you can use their passion for football and combine it with a passion for reading about football, in the various different mediums. That's what this does. And because the Premier League backs it, because there's real footballers involved, it has a huge effect. And the figures are over 80% of boys that take part in Premier League Reading Stars say that they enjoy reading much more. Their attitude to reading is changed enormously. And there is, if you put PLRS or Premier League Reading Stars into the internet, that you can find out much more about that scheme. And you can also, if you wish, access the videos for free if you want to see those and see if they'd be useful to you in your environment. So that is Premier League Reading Stars. Another angle of that before I finish. Often the scheme is used not just with children in the classroom, but with children in libraries with their parents. So a boy, and their parent are invited to do the sessions together. And part of that is about getting the child and the adult to talk about reading together in the library, and almost to model how they can speak about reading together with each other, so that they will take that model of behaviour home and talk more freely and easily about reading at home. And that's part of the idea behind the Premier League Reading Stars scheme. Right, so next one, thank you. Authors, I've already spoken about authors. That's Anthony Horowitz there on the top, the author of the Alex Rider stories. There's a big problem in schools in the United Kingdom, particularly in junior schools. There's very few male teachers in the state schools anyway. The school I mentioned earlier in Basildon has 28 teachers and teaching assistants. Last year, none of them were men, and this year one of them is, which is a huge improvement. In Basildon, again, the place where I work, a lot of the boys, they don't have fathers at home. They may have a stepfather or a second or a third stepfather at home, but they don't have a father, and they don't, because they don't have teachers and they don't have fathers at home, they don't have male role models. The male role models are often the older boys on the estates where they live, or the kinds of people that see on television in music videos, or they read about footballers behaving badly in the newspapers. And this is it's a really bad thing, and the boys need male role models. And many schools bring in men into schools, so they'll bring a fireman in, or a policeman, or someone who works in the military to come in and talk about their job and their life, but also to talk about reading as well, and how reading's a really fun thing to do, or an important thing to do if you want to do well in life. And one of the things which benefits male authors like myself is that there's a big demand in schools to get an author to come in who is a man, who can show. When I go in, I don't talk so much about these. I talk about how I hated reading and how my mum was really worried about me and I didn't do well at school. I talk about how reading changed my life, and how now reading and writing is my career. And I talk to the boys as well about how I get to go to countries like South Korea. I've met Wayne Rooney, Ronaldo, George Best, people like that. And they think that's wonderful, and they think, how did he get to meet those footballers? How did he get to visit those interesting countries? Because I read. And lots of all authors who go into schools and libraries do that, or should be doing that. And they go in and they show that reading is glamorous, can lead to something wonderful and positive and exciting in your life. And so having a male author in a school is a very good thing. Unfortunately, the negative side of that is with the cuts at the moment, there's less money for schools to bring authors in, so female authors are suffering by getting much less bookings to go into schools, which is a very negative flip side of that fact. Right, the next session is training young footballers to be role models. Again, it's football, I'm sorry. There's a scheme run by the National Literacy Trust, who I've mentioned quite a lot. The reason that they do so much to do with football is they employ someone called Jim Sells, and Jim does loads of work around football and reading, and he's very passionate about it too. So this, quickly, this is a scheme where young footballers who are training to be footballers between the ages of 16 and 18, are themselves trained how to go into schools and read to children collectively or one-to-one. They're told they are trained to do this as kind of as part of their being in a football academy. And they go into schools and they talk with children, and they're young and nervous, but they need, as well as being footballers, they need other life skills. So these young footballers are taken on to be role models. It's a scheme that's been going on for 4 years now, and it's really good for the children to meet young academy footballers, and to hear about how they articulate about reading. But it's also really good that the footballers get more confident as well, because I think a lot of the big issues with footballers these days is that they don't know what real life is like, because they've just got such an extraordinary lifestyle, and this helps them as well. So that's a really positive scheme too. The next scheme is poster campaigns. There's a scheme of posters. As you can see, there's some footballers there, cricketers, wrestlers. There are also musicians as well. And this has been done in other countries. It's been done in the States, and I think this is a copy of what happened in the States. I know actors and actresses have done this, but really it's a picture of a footballer or a singer reading, and with the tag "Champions Read," with a little quote about what they like to read. And it's every other library or school that I go into. In fact, more than half of them have these posters on the walls, and the children stop and look at them. They look at who the footballer or cricketer or whoever it is, and they look at the book, and it's just one more little nudge to them. Other things that I've seen go on is teachers do this. So teachers will have their photograph taken with a book and say what they're reading. Or children, like the older children, again, will sometimes have posters of themselves reading newspapers and magazines. And it's just a way of it's a role model. It's a simple device, just create a poster. With technology now, it's easy for us to take a photo and make up a poster like this of role models in our own schools and libraries, and this is a scheme which works really well and is very popular with schools and libraries. The next session is publishers. Publishers, as I explained earlier, very much want to be part of reader development. I understand from hearing at this conference today that book sales are going down in Korea, and I'm not sure that they're dipping as much in the UK, but publishers, they are dipping, and publishers are very keen not just to sell one book, like get Wayne Rooney's autobiography and sell it to tens of thousands of people, but they're keen to promote reading generally, because they know that they've got to lay the foundations for a literate society to operate as commercial organisations. And so lots of publishers now are thinking about how they publish books. So you'll have a lot of books now are more heavily illustrated. Boys in particular, but children don't like the block of text like this, for instance. So a block of text, it's intimidating. It certainly was to me, even when I was 15, 16, to see a block of text like that. So a lot of children's books now are illustrated. And you have, I know you'll be familiar with the Wimpy Kid and books in that kind. Books are being designed now to be less formal and less intimidating for children, like books that include graphic novel, passages of graphic novel, just to break it up a bit. And that is one thing that is popular in the UK, but also celebrity authors, celebrities who want to be authors. So you'll have actors, comedians, singers, and now footballers. Frank Lampard has just announced that he's going to be writing some football books. It's a good way of encouraging children to read. One phenomenon I've noticed in the UK is comedians. A lot of children aged 13 to 18 are reading comedians' autobiographies. There's a good comedy circuit in the UK, and those autobiographies are really popular at the moment. So publishing books that appeal in different ways, I mean, there's a flip side again for the likes of non-celebrity authors like myself, is that affects us in negative ways. But then if these techniques are building readers generally, then that's going to be good for everybody in the business. That's how I look at it, and if it's getting people reading, essentially. So publishers are very much part of this, having consulted with libraries and schools and children in particular. Right, there's 2 slides left. This is a new scheme which launched very recently. It's called Get Dads Reading. There was a media campaign run by the Book Trust, and the media campaign was run around the survey results that 1 in 8 fathers, sorry about the typo there, 1 in 8 fathers are the main reader with their children, which means that 7 out of 8 fathers aren't the main reader with their children. This was then reported in the news as only 1 in 8 fathers reads to their children, which isn't correct. It's 1 in 8 are the main reader, but it created news stories. And what the Book Trust did to back up this news story, which was on TV, in the radio, and in newspapers and online, was they created a resource where dads could go to look and see how they can read better with their children, what they can read to their children, how they can read. A bit like Book Trust, which I mentioned earlier on. And celebrity fathers were also asked to comment on liking reading with their children. This works because a survey creates a news story which creates lots of people arguing about the rights and wrongs of the survey. And that, if you can get a media organisation to back you in that way, it's a good way of raising issues around literacy. I wasn't quite sure about this scheme because I thought this was quite negative. It made, I'm not the main reader with my daughter. I read with her, but my wife reads more with her, and it made me feel like it was an attack on fathers, and I did wonder whether there was a more positive way of doing this. But it worked in that it got people debating, but it got a lot of people annoyed as well. Right, the last slide is Try Reading, and this is about rugby, so it's not about football. This is a scheme which is going on. As I've said, it's the Rugby League World Cup. And I showed you earlier that this 6-book challenge is using the Rugby League World Cup to engage adults with reading. This is a scheme based around children. And the idea is that when the Rugby League World Cup is on, there will be lots of events in libraries about the Rugby League, but also focusing on different books which might be about rugby or magazines. So there'll be lots of events in libraries. They've commissioned me to write 6 bedtime stories. There's a mascot with the Rugby League World Cup called Grubber. And I've been commissioned to write 6 stories about him, which are going to be given to parents at the rugby games. And they will be encouraged to read those stories at home with their children. And they're about the Grubber and the tournament. And I think that's a really nice way of tying in a big sporting occasion that everyone's going to be interested in with reading. There's also going to be a blog and blogs and about how, if you are interested in this sports tournament, you can read more about it. So the blog will link to match reports online. We'll talk about newspapers and magazines and books, and we'll interview authors who are interested in rugby league. So it's just a way of, if you're a rugby league fan, you may become a fan of reading about rugby league, and that, in the same way that I got into reading through football, these children, these families might get into reading through rugby league. Anyway, that's a short run through of various ways that have been used to get boys into reading, and as I've said, there's more details about that in the document that will be available soon. Thank you very much.